The valuation of Land Amendment Bill 2023 was passed in the lower house last week, Wednesday night. It's bringing us one step closer to property tax implementation. 232,000 homes have been evaluated. There's still many concerns. Business communities have expressed that they see it as being necessary. But at this point in time, the cost and the burden to consumers is going to affect businesses with the re-implementation of property tax. But the government is going full force ahead with it. Heading on the right track, in your mind?
Okay, so let me just say to begin with, I'm not sure if they're going ahead full force. And I have my reasons for saying, for making that statement. The other one I would make immediately, I don't know if there was ever any time that anyone said it was the right time. And, but I do think the fact of inflation, which is of course eats away at your purchasing power, and the fact for whatever reason the salaries have not increased over a number of years, does have a significant impact on the general populace. So why I am more than, intimate may not be the correct word, but I very much was the one that was driving the property tax system. I understood it, so I am just going to do a little background on that and show why I believe that I might be wrong. I hope I'm wrong in one way or the other, because this government is very weak on actual implementation and enforcement. So I think a lot of people, we've been asked before and we never got the chance to really go into the property tax. And of course we had the opposition mounting this AXI tax, which was totally, I mean, it sounded good. It was when Thatcher was there, but it was totally misleading. Just let me say the AXI tax was, why it was considered to be so unfair, and which was not our system, was that Margaret Thatcher felt that the municipal corporations were not operating well, that there was a lot of corruption within the system, and that is probably why the then Prime Minister, and now we now know that unless they make an announcement later on, that the taxes collected will go into the consolidated fund as other taxes do. But the difference between what they call AXI tax was because what Margaret Thatcher had is what they equated with the poll tax. A poll is your head. And it was determined, and they knew that most people who lived in urban areas, poor areas, you know, that nice way of saying that, were usually homes that would have a number of people living in those homes. Whereas when you went into the more rural or more refined areas, you might want to say, you probably found 2.5 people living there. And the tax was taxed not on the property, but on the number of persons living in the house. And it was felt to be very unfair because it was usually the people who were least able to afford the new tax that were the ones who were bearing the burden of it. But anyway, that had a lot to do with her losing her elections. So our property tax, which we had implemented, and in fact the act really hasn't changed. Despite all the administrations, the act was passed, and that was the only time that myself and Dr. Rowley, who I had a lot of respect for, by that time he had become a backbencher, he did vote with us, but he stood up and was very harsh in his condemnation of the tax and said that it was just a way of the government, had no money at that time, and they were trying to use this as a means of getting the tax. And that was not true, and he knew it was not true. But then he represents a very wealthy area on Diego Martin West, so I don't know if that had anything to do with it. But I was taken aback, actually, because before, he and I never had that, at least disagreement, never in Parliament. So for him to take that position, I was taken aback. So what was the property tax about, as I understood it? Now, I didn't start it, but I inherited it, and I brought it to fruition, which is why we still talk about the Property Tax Act of 2009. Why? Because it was passed during our administration, and I did manage the property tax, the whole oversight of it, so I'm very well acquainted with it. And it was intended to remove what we consider the inequities that existed in Trinidad and Tobago. Because once you lived in a municipal corporation, which would be Point Fortin, of course, Port of Spain, San Fernando, Rima, and then Chagonas was added, they were subject to the Municipal Corporation Act. Now, that was repealed in 2009 by the Property Tax Act. But what they had was the right to tax between 2 to 10%. 10% sounds like a lot. Whereas the rest of the country, which did not fall into the municipal corporation boundaries, used the old taxation method, which was passed in 1920, and you separated land from buildings. So the land was $10 per acre, and once you went over, I think, over 150 acres, I think you had to pay $15 per acre. And then they would tax the building separately, a higher rate, 7.5%. But guess what? The last time, and that's why you cannot separate the Property Tax Act from the valuation, because they value it, and based on the valuation and the agreed formula for determining the annual taxable value that you have to pay for the property depending on its classification, they both work hand in hand. And since 1948, it was the last time that properties that fell out of the municipal corporation had ever been valued. So you can well imagine, if you're talking 1948, that's nearly 100 years ago, you can well imagine that many properties that fell outside of the municipal corporation, there were new houses, renovated houses, maybe no houses, but certainly not the value of 1948. And that is what they based the tax on. The last valuation done in 1948 under the Valuation Act by the Commission of Valuations. When it came to the municipal corporations, it was governed by the Municipal Corporation Act. Now, they had the entitlement that was repealed by the Property Tax Act of 2009, that section. But prior to its repeal, the municipal corporation was entitled to set the tax that had to be paid within the corporation between 2 to 10%. And 10%, you would say to yourself, that's a lot. But I bring you back now, it depends on what the valuation was. That's where you have to start. So let us look, for example, at Port of Spain. Yes, the taxes that they applied for residential, commercial, and industrial, there was no agricultural, was 10%. That's very high. When's the last time they did a valuation of that property in the municipal corporation? 1975. So you can imagine that people who lived in Ellerslie Park, Federation Park, I have no quarrel with them, St. Clair, etc. People who own properties, people who own commercial properties, who own stores or whatever in the municipal corporation of Port of Spain, they were paying 10% on a valuation that hadn't been done since 1975. So they were paying next to nothing. They didn't have any complaints. Now, when it came to San Fernando, the valuations were updated to 2004, and it was 8% across the board. Arima, they did it in 2002, and it was 10 for residential and commercial, and 6% for industrial. Point Fortin, which had, of course, the refinery, you had residential 2, commercial 2.5, and industrial 6, agricultural 2. But it all came back, always came back to valuation. So just by way of, before I explain, and the gentleman tell me take a rest and let us have a word in, just to let you understand the difference. People who lived in San Fernando within the municipal corporation boundaries, since 2008, when we did evaluations based on the new property tax, which would be 3%, they were paying more taxes than any other part of the country, and certainly more taxes that they were going to pay if they continued under the old system. So in fact, they had already been doing it. Nobody even recognized that, and there was no protest. And that would also be, that's definitely San Fernando, that is true, because I actually have some figures here. So the point about it, it became very politicized because and let me just say this too now. You said the Valuation Amendment Act was just passed. You don't take that lightly.